You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey, Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mom,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Devin Murphy.
Flesh, Blood, Steel, the new book from David Allen Jones. 16-year-old Jake Harris wakes up after a horrific car accident to find 13 years have come and gone. He's 29 years old, a cyborg, and one of the world's most feared assassins. Horrified by the things he's done, things he can't remember, Jake vows never to kill again. Unfortunately, the company that owns Jake has other plans. They're not about to lose their top hitman to the errant memories of his teenage self. When Jake manages to escape them, they launch a worldwide manhunt that ranges from a near-future New York City to Paris. Desperate to remain himself, Jake joins a rebel faction dedicated to wresting control of the world's governments from the hands of militarized corporations. Using his enhanced body and perceptions, he is able to aid them in their fight. But Jake doesn't realize the rebels have their own plans for him, ones that involve unleashing his unique talents on their enemies. Faced with a dark past he can't recall and uncertain whom he should trust, Jake must come to terms with the sinister choices that molded him into the man he became. The question is, can he avoid doing it all again? Assassins aren't born, they're programmed. Flesh, Blood, Steel by David Allen Jones. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have Devin Murphy on the show with me today. Devin has a fantastic new book that is out today, and it is called Tiny Americans. And this is a novel like none that I've read in quite some time. So I'm really excited to talk with you today. Devin, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Hank. Thanks for having me, and thanks for taking the time to talk with me and be so excited about this book. I'm really thrilled to be here.
Yeah. We begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
Oh, good one. I kind of have a moment where it clicked for me. I don't know if it happened before then. I think growing up as a kid, I sort of was a bit of a spy and listening to my family stories and kind of trying to make sense of what was going on and put pieces together. So in that sense, I think I had the training of a storyteller already in the works, very young, but I know the moment that this kind of happened for me. My father saw I wasn't really doing great in school, and all I really wanted to do as a boy was play soccer. And so he, in a really great stroke of being an educator himself, brought home a book of poems for me about sports. And it was edited by George Plimpton, the former editor of the Paris Review. And there's a poem in there about Pele, the great Brazilian soccer player.
Right.
And there was a line in there that just blew me away. And it was spoken as if it was Pele, the soccer player. And Pele, knowing how great he was, says, "Pass the sun to me. I'll put it between my legs and cage it in the back of the net." And I was a little boy, and I thought, holy cow, you can do that with language? I don't think I really understood what language was capable of and how malleable it was and how it could represent the world in these interesting, beautiful ways. And so I couldn't say that articulately at the time, but I felt it. And so that moment, it didn't turn me into a good student, but it did turn me on to language. And so I was always the kid who would read the books, but maybe not do the homework after that. And so that was the moment that language became alive to me. And ever since then, I kind of was reading for the beauty of words and beauty of stories, and then that turns you into looking at the world that way. So that's kind of the moment I would say that really kind of turned me on and kept me going.
Wow. Have you gone back and communicated how important that was to your dad? What it meant to you? Yeah. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm sorry. What it meant to me? I'm really close to my dad, so we talk all the time about sort of that kind of, what that moment meant to me. I've definitely told him about that. But also my dad's a philosophy professor. And so for years he's been reading all these kind of wild, weird books, and him and I, we don't read the same material. I can't read the abstract material that he reads, and he gets a little lost in the sort of narrative purple prose that I love. But in between, when we talk about them, we can kind of share ideas, and that's kind of a foundational element of how we communicate and what we love about each other. So yeah, I've definitely told him my gratitude, and he certainly put me on the path to a lot of great books in my life. That was just the start.
That's fantastic. As you grew and you had this love of language ignited in you, did you know that you were going to pursue this like after high school, and what was your path for college?
So I think I knew that as maybe a young boy, I wasn't great at expressing my emotions, which is pretty common, I think, for young men and young boys. But when I was reading, it felt like everything was scraped away, and it was just like the raw core of what it was like to be alive. And so I was really idealistic and taken by literature. And so all through high school, I would do enough to get B's and let my dad make me keep playing sports, but then I would be plowing through these books. And so I always kind of loved these books, but everything seemed like unachievable. It seemed like the work of genius, like the classes that give you these great pieces of literature, they seem like they were done from people outside of my realm of intellect and possibility. And so it just seemed like an unachievable thing. And then, so through high school, I was a reader. And then I went to college, actually, where my dad teaches at St. Bonaventure University, because I got tuition remission. And it was like, you're going there, buddy. No sense in flying across the country. You're going there. And when I got there, my freshman composition teacher, it was a Franciscan school, but it was sort of non-denominational. And my freshman composition teacher was a guy named Rick Simpson, who was an ex-Mormon, a poet, a saxophone player, and a baseball lover. And in the composition class, he would talk about baseball, poetry, or jazz, and not so much about writing. But he talked about them with this infused love of all three. And I was, an 18-year-old guy, and I was into sports, and I just joined the rugby team in college. And here's this big guy talking about how beautiful the world is. And I'd been thinking about that and how language can capture that, but I hadn't really been talking about that. I didn't want to raise my head up and articulate that. And he was a really great role model for me. And he kind of turned me on to poetry. And again, there was this love of language, and he kind of introduced me to literary canon. And so I started studying literature with just this deep affection and love. And then I started getting into novels seriously. And so it was through his influence and taking this guy's classes over and over again that I really fell in love with reading as a way to like, hey, maybe I could do this. But I was still a little timid to tell anyone I wanted to do that. Like basically I want to be a fiction writer, and that's the equivalent of career suicide, So, so I kept it to myself for a long time, but I was definitely getting the bug.
I love the idea of the teacher that infuses a love of language and a love of seeing the world differently without actually teaching you about language. Those are lessons and gifts that are not easily given or not easily found. You can teach the regimen of writing, but the way to look at the world and the way to appreciate things is a whole different kind of education.
Yeah, and to tell you, maybe to put a stamp on how profound this teacher was for me, and then many of my teachers, is I think I've modeled my life after that guy. I'm now a college English and creative writing professor, right? If that tells you how important that guy was to me. And I thought, that was maybe the most impactful gift I was given, which was instead of language and literature something unachievable, language and literature is something that can be part of your life, and you can interweave in your life and make a part of your life. And so I was so moved by that ability and that gift that I've been trying to share it ever since, I think.
So when you started dipping into fiction writing, what were some of the things that you were tackling?
Well, so I was terrible, is what it turns out. I wasn't very good at all, and so at first I think you start with, you're a little turned on because you realize you can put your imagination on paper and kind of create these worlds, but then you don't really know anything about the genres itself. And so to start, I wrote poetry, and they were just dreadful because, you don't have world experience and you don't understand the craft. And so I had a few things in my favor. I I'm capable of being gritty, meaning like I can sustain long periods of work and rejection and all the things that might turn people away. I can kind of grit my teeth and get through that. And also I wanted to do something in this field, and I knew it was going to take a lot of hard work. And so I never I would produce a lot, and then I'd eventually realize why it wasn't good. And I'd keep going back to my reading and trying to improve my writing. And so I did this all through college as an undergraduate. And for a while I was maybe wrong-headed because I thought maybe I'm just not that good of a writer and I'm not that creative. And so therefore maybe I have to live a interesting life to write about. I could be like a nonfiction writer and I could do something interesting and see the world in an interesting way and share that. And so I ended up working I just started in high school and all through college. And after college, I ended up working in the travel industry. I'd get any job I could that would take me to an interesting place. Whether it be Glacier National Park in Montana, I was a tour guide and I served hot dogs in Rocky Mountain National Park in Colorado, and I fixed skis in New Hampshire. So I could just be out in all these interesting outdoor places. And eventually that led me to working on expedition cruise ships that went all over the world. And I did that for about 3 years. And what I was doing is I was really trying to capture stories and trying to learn what to write about. And so I would go to this interesting place like Antarctica and I'd write about it, but then my stories were still really terrible. And along that way, I was realizing that I don't really know anything about fiction writing. Like I'm enthusiastic and energetic and I have the energy to do this, but I don't know what I'm doing. And then I realized that there was these graduate programs, these MFAs, and it was at one point, like I had this dream job. I was sailing all over the world and I was going to all 7 continents and it was really fantastic, but I was doing it in order to tell stories. And I realized that I needed to go learn to tell stories. And so I left that job to go get an MFA. And I thought, okay, this will teach me what I'm doing. And when I got to the MFA, I was by far the worst writer there. and I thought, oh no, I've ruined my life. I just gave up this dream job and I can't even do this. And what happened is, I just spent 3 years working exceedingly hard to figure out all the craft elements of fiction. And then that was basically an apprenticeship to spend the rest of my life studying and challenging myself against the genre. And so I've been doing that ever since.
Is there one particular thing that you could put your finger on that the MFA program unlocked for you or taught you that you were overlooking? Does it come down to a point for you, or was this just kind of a broad array of tools that you picked up?
Well, I think I could probably name a few points, but in reality, it might be the broader range of tools. And what really did it for me is I think it sort of professionalizes you in the sense that young writers will have an idea and write it down, and then they think, well, that either works or didn't work. And more professional writers know that it's going to start as garbage, and you're going to have to go back and figure out why it's garbage, and then you apply the tools that you have to make it better, and then you're going to have to realize that you're going to have to go learn new tools to make it really good. And so it was really like, this is the process, and it takes a long time, and it involves some sort of cyclical levels in your own life, which you have energy for a project, and then that fades. And so how do you get it back? And you are emotionally invested in a project, and then if it doesn't work, you feel down. How do you kind of sustain a more level base of just productivity? And so it gave me examples of how to be creative over the long run. It also taught me the habit of you work and work and work and work until something goes right, and then you challenge yourself for the next project. And it also gave me role models of like, hey, my teachers are talking about what they love, and then they have their summers to do it themselves. And I thought, well, that's exactly what I want to do, right? And so it was, for me, a real put your money where your mouth and your heart is kind of moment. And so I went for it, and I thought, I'm going to see, I might as well. I was free and single at the time, so I gave it a try. And then to pay for it, they make you teach the undergraduate classes, and I turned out I loved doing that. So it was a real gift to me to have done it.
You spent 3 years at sea, visiting 50 countries and just seeing the world. How do you feel like those experiences helped you to understand people, to see the world differently? Do you look back on those times and see how they've affected your creative process?
Yeah, a lot. It in retrospect, it was sort of this crazy thing to do, but it started well before that. Like I knew I wanted to travel around the world, but I had no money. I was just a poor kid. I had no resources to do it. So I thought, well, I could work at all these places. And so I mentioned going to those national parks. And eventually, I ended up for a summer between my college semesters on a small boat in Alaska that did the Inside Passage, and it was owned by the native tribe up there. And it was a 50-passenger boat, and I was a deckhand. I would basically serve drinks, throw on coveralls, dock the boat, chip paint, and I worked my tail off. But I loved it, and I realized that these ships go all over the planet, and I thought, well, there's my ticket to ride. And I kept applying until they hired me, and it was really a foundational part of my life, because eventually what happened is I ended up on these ships, and they don't want Americans on these ships because we're too expensive. We want health insurance, and we want to be flown here and there, and we want vacations. And so all these ships are full of mostly international laborers, like from the Philippines or Greece or Eastern Europe. And so I was surrounded by all these international workers. And at sea, there's very much like a caste system. The captain's in charge for a reason, but he has his officers to basically carry out his orders. And I was a low on the totem pole there, but then below me was all these professional sailors that were way more competent than me. And I was just a kid, and I was sort of in charge because I was an American. And so it really took me out of my country, literally, and then let me kind of see how our country works in the rest of the world, and how that gives us some privileges and some insights, but also sort of blinds us to other things. And so in a lot of ways, I've sort of been dealing with that experience ever since. And in my next writing project, I'm really trying to lay that out on the page. And I've been calling up all those people I sailed with years ago, and saying, hey, how did you perceive what was going on here, and what was your role there? And I'm finding all this amazing material to work with. And so, yeah, it was this huge part of my life that I think about a lot, especially now that I haven't been to sea for quite a long time. My life's much different now. Right. It was a great single guy life. Yeah.
Tell me about your book, The Boat Runner.
Sure. So The Boat Runner, I spent about 10 years, a little less than 10 years, really trying to figure this book out. And I tell people, they ask me how long it took, and I say, well, it took about 10 years to write, but it really took about 20 years to write, because I had spent 10 years figuring out how to write, like those MFA years, and before then just struggling and figuring out the genre, and then figuring out, like, how do you write a sentence? How do you write a scene? And so The Boat Runner has got a few sort of puzzle pieces that went in. And the big one is that my mother is from the Netherlands, and she was born there and grew up there, and her father died when she was, I think, 17 or 18. And after that, she wanted to change. So she came to the United States as a nanny to the Dutch consulate in San Francisco. And there she met my father, who's from San Francisco, and they ended up getting married. And my father, and a short version of the story, ended up with this job at St. Bonaventure in West New York. And I was born there. And so I grew up with this philosophy professor father and a Dutch mother. And it was like, this is kind of a kooky pair of people. And so I kept hearing these stories about, like, I would hear bits of my dad's story of his life in San Francisco, which was across the country, and then my mother's life across the sea. And I didn't really and we just had my two older sisters, and me was our whole family unit. And so I was really curious about my family. And so I was sort of that spy. I would glom onto stories. And one of the stories I caught a hold of was my mother's father, who died, was an electrical engineer for Philips, which became Philips Magnavox. And he was a really high-end research and development head of these departments. And what he was working on was radar tubes, or radio tubes, which were the foundational element of radar and sonar. And so when the Nazis took over the Netherlands, they wanted all the engineers and scientists. And this guy had to go into hiding. And I heard that story, and I thought, oh, that's really interesting. And this grandfather of mine who I never met, he was 6'6". And I kept thinking, well, how's that big giant going to hide? And there was rumors I heard that he hid in a monastery. He went to England, he got to Canada, or he'd been killed. And my grandmother didn't know where her husband was, and she went out looking for him. And I just that story stuck with me for a long, long time. And what would it be like to not be a combatant, but to be stuck in the middle of that chaos, and your countries had to bow down to a larger force? And so that was always interesting. And so I started thinking about that grandfather character. And for years and years, I just sort of thought that's something I can deal with, but I didn't quite have the skill or really the place to put that bit of story. And then years later, when I was working on these boats, all the captains were from Germany, because the North Sea is the hardest bit of water to see to sail in the world. And so these Germans, if they could do the North Sea, they could do the Arctic, the Antarctic, they could go up rivers and the Amazon on these boats. And so they're really proficient seamen. And I got to know these German captains, and they were very stern but competent and interesting. And I realized that their world was right across this waterway from where my mother grew up and where my grandfather go into hiding. And I started kind of thinking about that border a bunch because of these guys and seafaring. And just piece by piece over the years, little interesting pieces of my life and my experience started kind of like clicking together. And eventually I started writing about it. And the final piece was I just picked up a random book about the German Navy in World War II, and it was written by a German admiral, and it was published in 1945, just as the war was ending. And he said, I would have won the war if Hitler left me alone, because I had these U-boats and we were sinking everything. We were controlling the seas. The Allies couldn't get their supplies where they needed. And he said that every ship I sink, it's the equivalent of a land battle won. And he referred to this ship as going down as tonnage. And the language is so cold and chilling that, because I just spent 3 years on these ships, and I knew the crew, and I loved the crew, and I loved my life, and I just loved the idea of seafaring and getting to know different cultures. And this guy just said, I'm just going to sink that ship, and it's the equivalent of tonnage of material, opposed to the hundreds or thousands of people that were on that boat. And that callous loss of life that he just was okay talking about, it felt like he must have been brainwashed to do that. And so I was really interested in sort of the propaganda these guys had to deal with to think like that. And then I started doing a little research about World War II, and I found all about these Hitler youth camps that basically brainwashed an entire generation of children so that they would think like that admiral, and they would be okay with the callous loss of other people's lives if it was good for the fatherland. So it went click, 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 and years of these things clicking together, and then years of writing and learning how to figure out a novel all eventually led to The Boat Runner.
And an incredible accomplishment. It's really this fantastic character study, and of the way whole people think. It's that had to be a gratifying experience to get through the writing of that.
It was gratifying, but it also, I don't think I could have done it without all my previous experiences. So going through that MFA, you asked, like, I had to get rejected a lot. I had to figure out stories and submit them and get rejected and realize why it wasn't working and then go back to them. And so it was the same thing, just on a bigger scale with this novel. You know, for a long time, I didn't think I was going to be able to do it. And I kept going back and I kept going back. And I would read some book and it would blow me away with the voice. And so I'd go back and I'd look at my book and think, is my voice okay? And then I'd read another book and I'd realize the emotional depth of this character was way more impactful than mine. And so I take that back to my book. And so what I was doing is I was looking for new lenses to bring back and look at my work anew. And you have to do that hundreds and 1,000 times. And then you have to basically turn over a whole library of your reading to make that happen. So in that way, it was really delightful that it finally got published, but it was a really exhausting process. And so and now at least I kind of knew, okay, well, this is the work required if this is the product I'm after. And you just sort of, I had to go blind faith with The Boat Runner. But now that I've done The Boat Runner, I kind of know that that's the template I have to follow. So it was a real learning curve and exhausting, but also delighted. And so really, I don't do good very well emotionally removing myself from my work. And so that's kind of a process I have to get better at as I get older here.
Well, your new book, Tiny Americans, is nearly diametrically opposed to the previous book, but is just as deep and satisfying. Where did the idea for this book come from? And when I was reading this, it kind of reminds me of Faulkner in the way that you use descriptions and a little bit of the Snopes family. What was the intention for this book, and where did the idea for this family come from?
It's really amazing you mentioned Faulkner, because not so much for the Snope family, but I'm very versed in Faulkner. I really went the whole deep well of Faulkner at one point in my life, and I really loved him. But what I took from him that eventually clicked this whole book together was that idea of that small postage stamp to write from of the world. And my problem was for years that with all those travels, every one of my stories I was writing, and I was writing stories all the time, they were taking place in a different part of the world. And I was traveling around, so it made sense that I was really fascinated in finding these stories and writing about them. And what was happening is I was publishing stories, and eventually, after this whole long period of writing these stories while I was also working on The Boat Runner, they started kind of clicking into place. I realized when I was writing about younger teenager kids, and maybe tapping into that challenge of masculinity and what it means, and challenge of growing up under weird circumstances. And so the themes of those stories just started working a little better for me. They came more natural. And then once I thought about, all right, well, what are the themes that are really running through all my work here? I had to do a self-assessment. And once I did that, I realized that I'm really kind of drawn to writing about the place I was born, which I didn't actually grow up in. So I was born in the town this university my dad teaches in, but I grew up in Buffalo, an hour away. And so I ended up deciding, okay, well, what if I just set the story there? Because I know the place and it's interesting to me, and it has some heat and relevance to my imagination. And what if I just kind of build a world out from there? And so I did take from Faulkner the idea of pick one postage stamp of the world and really try to own it. And so I started writing lots of stories about that place, and I eventually sent them all to my agent, and she said, I said, here's a story collection about this place. And she said, oh, this is way too many stories, so I'm going to cut this, and I really love your novel. And I said, oh, that's great. It's a short story collection, though. And she sent it to my editor, and my editor said, oh, this is great. I'm going to cut this, and this, though, and this is a really great novel. I said, oh, great. This is a short story collection, though. And the editor sent it to the publisher, and the publisher said, well, let's cut. And we want to buy this novel. And I said, fantastic. I hope you like my novel. And so what happened is I sort of was like playing around with a place and a family. And through the process of really honing down the focus, I realized that this one family was my access to not only a place, but like a class in our country, and how that affects people and how they have to kind of shrug and buck against that the rest of their life. And so that one place became the launching point for a family out into the world that I had been traveling around in. And so that was sort of this kind of reverse engineering all these stories down into a set of themes I wanted to work with, and then building a novel up from there. And so once Harper Perennial actually said, yeah, let's do this, I really had to go back and work like crazy to figure out where this should go. And so it's been the last few years of really getting help from my agent and editor, which was also really a brilliant thing to have people so invested and talented to help you. Were the first, years I was alone doing this stuff. And so the story kind of was organic like that. And I'm really happy it's kind of out in the world, and a little scared that it's out in the world. But yeah.
It's, the title is kind of a play, on words. What does the title mean?
Well, so there's a line later in the book where, a main character is going to kind of come to a realization about his own life and his feelings towards himself and his feelings towards his family and his feeling towards his country, because he has been traveling outside of the country and getting that global perspective that you asked me about earlier. Like I very much tried to capitalize on that experience of my own and give it to this character. And so he kind of sees this event, and he realizes that we as Americans are sort of, we are impulsive, and we go by the whims of our wants sometimes that are more surface level before addressing the deeper selves within us. And he's sort of been made to feel small by that. And he's got to kind of come out of that to take ownership of his own life. And so that became this sort of really relevant passage to me in the book that I loved. And and he references seeing, he's up on a hill and he's looking down and he's seeing, to his great surprise, in Wyoming, this great trail of pilgrims on the Mormon Trail, marching out west. And he just thinks this whole country's full of people wandering around, trying to find themselves, trying to make good in their lives. And he says, tiny Americans wandering and wandering. And that just sort of resonated with me long enough that I felt like this book is about one family, but they're very representative of the place that made them.
Yeah. The novel began as a short story collection, like you said. When you're tackling a short story versus a novel, in the beginning, do those two forms feel different to you, and do you approach them differently?
A little, because like I said, I mean, I didn't really know how you wrote a novel. And when I started writing, it was just these short stories that came to me. And then I had to realize, basically, okay, how do you write a scene? Like, how do you make something happen in real time and make it come alive in a reader's mind? And so when I teach now, I really want to teach my students how to write a scene, how to make something vivid and alive. And John Gardner called it a vivid, continuous dream. That's what fiction should be in your reader's mind. And so I had to figure out that. In a short story, it's got all the elements of fiction in it, as well as a novel, but it's more compressed. And compression's not just, I'm just going to use less words. It has to be crystalline. It has to be perfect. And so it's very challenging to write a short story. And then when you think, okay, I know all the craft elements of developing a character and setting out a plot, well, you would think you could just equally apply those to a novel, but it's a lot different because pacing's strange and you have time to sort of dwell. And so to me, the base craft elements of a short story really taught me how to just make a scene. And then when you figure out a novel, you just have to kind of figure out enough scenes that are engaging to keep your reader, and then order them and write them all well. So it was the same skills that got me there, but I had to write 100 stories before this novel finally clicked into place. And then I wrote 100 more along the way. And, out of the couple hundred stories I've written, maybe 100 have been published. And the rest have just kind of fallen away and are either for the scrap heap, or there's material there that just hasn't found a place or the real heart of the story yet for me to work with. So I'm sort of always working, because I know now that these stories can become novels. Novels might fail and become stories. Some of them, sometimes they just don't work out at all. So it's just sort of, you go at it and hopefully the story will tell you the shape it wants to be. And that could be a short story. It could be a novel. So that's the exciting part for me.
Well, Tiny Americans is absolutely fascinating. It's a fantastic read. I'm going to send everybody to pick up their copy of it. It's out, available everywhere now, today. Devin, if people are just learning about you and want to dig into the work that you do and look at your back catalog, is there a place where they can find you online?
Yeah, I have a website, devinmurphyauthor.com, and I'm really lucky. When I was in graduate school, I met a friend, Drew Nolte, who was a great poet, but also an amazing web designer. So he put the website together for me, and you can find some of my work there, a little bio and pictures of books and all that. So, and thanks to talking to you, my voice is out there as well. So.
Absolutely. Devin, it's been a lot of fun talking. I wish you much success on the book launch, and we're going to send everybody to pick up their copy of Tiny Americans. Thank you so much for taking time to come on the show today.
Hank, thanks for all these great soulful questions, and really enjoyed talking to you. I appreciate your time and sharing the books out with the world.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
I was walking through the woods between Wolfert's Roost and the future site of my father's Stone Manor house. The house would eventually stand on what had been old Baltus's pumpkin field, the land where I had found my grandfather's head. Father had chosen the spot for its view of the Hudson River. Knoll was to be a grand mansion in the Gothic Revival style, but at the time the mansion was but a few foundations of Van Brunt stone. I had become fond of the place already, the idea of it, and I spent many a night alone in a shack on the property. My mother disapproved. She would have me sleep in the room across from hers in our townhouse. But I was 15 and did not answer to her. I kept a bottle of spirits hidden in the crook of 2 walnut trees near old Baltus's grave. I thought he would approve of the gesture. I had stopped along my way to fetch it out. At the moment the first pull of liquor touched my throat, I heard a ghastly, inhuman laugh. I was not alone in the woods. Had God sent the horseman after me? Had I sinned that terribly? I ran through the wood and found the field where Noel was to be built. The outline of the foundations was barely discernible beneath the snow. An apparition stood there. Though I have seen him many times since, I shall never forget my first glimpse. Gaunt in moonlight, headless, exuding power and malice. A magic thing in the land of the ordinary. The headless horseman of Sleepy Hollow. What chills those words evoke! It charged at me, hatchet raised. I stood transfixed, unable to move, unable to even imagine escape. This was the servant of God, after all, sent to strike down sinners. I hurled the bottle from my hand, ashamed that I had become a drunkard as Baltus had been. It shattered against the foundations of Noel. I stretched out my arms and awaited judgment. A piercing white light broke the darkness. The horse reared. "Not my Dylan!" cried Agatha, appearing from the wood. She held a skull in her hand. It shone brightly as a diamond, and in that moment I understood. The horseman did not serve God, he served my grandmother. Perhaps in that moment I came to see Agatha and God as one and the same. The unholy spirit fought her command. A foreleg of the demon horse struck my head with such power that I fell backwards with a cry and knew no more. I carry the scar to this day. A slight indentation in my temple, barely noticeable. In my days of courting I was told that when I am angry the patch of insulted skull bone will stand out in a disturbing manner. I have never had occasion to see this phenomenon, however, as I am generally well pleased whenever I pass a mirror.